Well, good morning, and welcome to the Federalist Society's 2025 National Security and AI Symposium. I'm Nate Kazmarek, Vice President for Practice Groups and Networks at the Society. Thank you for joining us here at the Mayflower, and welcome to those of you joining us virtually via the live stream. At the outset, I'd like to express my personal gratitude to many people who helped to make this event possible. Thanks to many members of the Federalist Society staff, especially Caroline Bryant, for her instrumental help in organizing the day. I'd also like to acknowledge the continued efforts of many of our practice group leaders, including Jamil Jaffer, Professor Julian Koo, and Matthew Hyman, all of whom you'll be hearing from more today. Lastly, my thanks goes to Devin Patel for his valued input and continued support of our work. These are extraordinary times, and our conversations today could not be more essential. In recent months, the White House has released updated AI governance and national security strategies, highlighting risk assessment, standard setting, and cross-agency coordination. These frameworks attempt to balance innovation with accountability and to guide how we respond to dual-use technologies in domains from defense to critical infrastructure. That's the background against which each of today's panels will operate. At the same time, the U.S.-China strategic relationship across economics, technology, and security has grown more competitive and more fraught than at any time in a generation. The CCP is pushing ambitious lines in AI development, industrial policy, military modernization, and perspectives on sovereignty in data and cyberspace. China is increasingly framing AI as a domain of competition and treating strategic autonomy and technology as essential to its national security doctrine. The result is that the gravitational center of global AI strategy is shifting. Norms, supply chains, and alliance architectures are all in flux. So it's no longer enough for the U.S. to ask, how do we regulate AI? We must also ask, in a world of competing techno orders, where does U.S. authority, influence, and alliance structure fit? That's not a question of ideology alone. It's about deterrence, diplomatic posture, resiliency, and the legal constraints on agency behavior in competition and conflict. Throughout the day, we'll discuss how alliances should adapt, how laws of war apply, how commitments in Taiwan or treaty obligations should interact with the new technology, and how the United States can craft a sustainable posture in competition that doesn't overcommit or create dangerous dependencies. Before we dive in, the usual disclaimer applies. The Federal Society doesn't take positions, and all views expressed here belong to our speakers. For our audience, I would note that bios for all of our speakers today are available on our website, fedsoc.org. Also, at the end of each panel today, we've reserved time for audience Q&A, and the microphones are in the middle of the room, so please think about the questions you'd like to ask our experts. With that, I'm delighted to turn to our first panel on bolstering the alliance system and introduce our moderator, Matthew Hyman. Matthew is the chairman of the Federalist Society's International and National Security Practice Group. We remain grateful for his generous and continued leadership. He has held senior legal and compliance roles, including at Johnson Controls and Tyco International. In government, Matthew served in the Department of Justice's National Security Division as a legal advisor in Baghdad for the Coalition Provisional Authority. He began his career as a trial lawyer in private practice. His BA and JD are from Indiana University, and he is a member of the International Institute for Strategic Studies. I think you'll agree that his mix of legal acumen, strategic insight, and experience make him an ideal guide for today's opening discussion. Matthew, with gratitude, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Nate, and thank you to the Federalist Society for hosting us today, and I want to echo Nate's thanks to the staff, in particular Caroline Bryant. I'm also grateful for those of you here in the audience and those of you joining us by live stream. I expect it to be a very good discussion on this panel and then the three panels throughout the day. And as Nate said, please be thinking about your questions. I will be sure to reserve 15 to 20 minutes at the end of this discussion for Q&A from the audience. I'm going to make very brief introductions of our 4 panelists who have very lengthy and impressive CVs. If you want to know more about their background, please refer to the program or the material online. And I'm just going to go in alphabetical order. So first, Richard Fontaine, to my right, extreme right. Richard is CEO of the Center for a New American Security. He served at the National Security Council, at the State Department, and as a foreign policy advisor to Senator John McCain. He is also the executive director of the Trilateral Commission's North America Group and serves as a trustee of Anthropic. Michael Maza. Mike is the senior director for research at the Institute for Indo-Pacific Security. He analyzes U.S. policy in the Indo-Pacific region, cross-strait relations, and Asian security issues. He is concurrently a senior non-resident fellow at the Global Taiwan Institute and previously spent 15 years at the American Enterprise Institute, where he contributed to studies on American grand strategy in Asia, U.S. defense strategy in the Asia-Pacific, and Taiwanese defense strategy. Eli Ratner is a principal at the Marathon Initiative. He has served in senior positions at the Pentagon, White House, State Department, and U.S. Senate. Most recently, he was the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Indo-Pacific Security Affairs from 2021 to 2025. And finally, Adam Savitt is the Director of the China Policy Initiative at the America First Policy Institute. He co-authored the chapter on China policy for AFPI's 2024 book, An America First Approach to U.S. National Security, which has been an influential touch point for diplomats, decision makers, and news media among our Asian allies. So as you can see, we've got a very credible panel to discuss the issue before us today. And that issue is America's alliance network and what competitive advantage it provides. If we think about it historically, the origins of sort of the current alignment of U.S. Alliance network could probably point to begin post-World War II, where there were intentional efforts to create institutions that would amplify the power and connectivity of America's alliance networks, whether we're thinking about NATO, other treaty organizations. And that has continued from administration to administration, even throughout the close of the Cold War, where the U.S. alliance network was amplified by a number of countries, particularly those in Eastern Europe, after getting out from under the thumb of the Soviet Union, quickly aligned themselves with U.S. and Western policy initiatives when it comes to international security. So today, we see ourselves in a world in which China is our primary competitor. And China itself is trying to build its own alliance network. And what we want to do with today's discussion is to talk about what is the health of the U.S. network, what is China doing, and where is their competitive advantage or where is their vulnerability for the U.S. as it continues to seek a world in which the rule of law applies and that is generally conducive to democracy and capitalism. So with that, I'm going to start with an opening question. I'm going to direct this first to Adam, and what I'll do is I'll direct it to a panelist, and then I'll ask the other panelists to chime in. So Adam, if we could start with you. Does President Trump's approach to engaging with U.S. allies, does it enhance or diminish our ability to compete with China?
I think in some it enhances. I think it's obviously still in progress. But one thing I'd point to is the continuity in his approach, most especially in the multilateral and minilateral approach, which was initiated in his first term, as well as the Biden administration and continues today. Perhaps most prominently, the Quad, of course, conceived by PM Abe back quite a while back, but in Trump's first term was really initiated, and they both really picked up the banner of that arrangement rather than alliance. In the Biden administration, it was perhaps not, it was not codified, but it was reinforced. And in the current Trump administration, it has been embraced once again. The very first meeting that Secretary Rubio took on January 21st was a meeting of the foreign ministers of the Quad Alliance. Now, the trilateral, founded by the Biden administration, has been incredibly useful in the past year, with President Yoon being arrested, being impeached, and a caretaker government in the Republic of Korea for about the past year. Of course, they've been in flux. And with the election of President Lee and sort of an unknown player in the international stage and an unknown relationship with Japan, his party with a history, or his side of the equation in Korea with a history of an adverse relation to Japan, the trilateral has been an invaluable construct to keep those alliances in line. And of course, AUKUS, now this one might be most in question in this term, but I believe it still will be viable. I think the biggest threat is a real serious evaluation of whether our defense industrial base can sustain, can build those submarines for ourselves and also deliver to Australia. Of course, there is the figure of Elbridge Colby sitting above this question. Of course, there was a review by the Department of War of the AUKUS arrangement, but most recently it was reported that Marco Rubio said behind closed doors that, quote, Colby likes to review things. So I think that is a signal from the administration that they're taking this alliance seriously. Now on to the more controversial, or what might be seen as more of a break from the previous administrations. That would be the call for burden sharing and the call for greater spending on GDP. To put that in context, I think we should look back to the first Trump administration when President Trump was calling for increased spending from NATO. Let's look back to a very quaint time when 2% was considered radical to ask from our NATO allies. Now, of course, now they're sort of clamoring amongst each other to pay 5%, notable exception of Spain. But now this is sort of accepted as a rubric to see the commitment of allies. I think the same thing is coalescing in the Pacific. It's not a direct analogy. Of course, in NATO, you have the fact that Russia is a very clear and present threat, and of course they actually initiated a hot war. But in China, you have the same unifying threat that in the first island chain, I think, will keep allies on side. So I think generally speaking, it's moving in a positive direction.
Eli, response?
Yeah, sure. Well, maybe just start by saying thank you. Great to be here. You've got a great agenda today, so thanks to the Federalist Society for inviting me. Also, just want to acknowledge the importance of the focusing on the China challenge, the fact that you're starting off there. There's a lot of important things going on in the world today, but from my perspective, none of them range even close to the challenge from China that we're facing as a country. So great job highlighting that. Look, I agree with some of what Adam said. I guess the way that I would characterize it is I think there are priorities of the Trump administration inside the alliance framework. I think we've seen that around the dominant focus on defense spending, particularly in Europe and now in the Indo-Pacific. Personally, I think that's a little narrow in terms of what we should be asking of our allies and partners, but the focus has very much been on the percentage of defense spending, and they've had some success in that regard. I don't think that's a total discontinuity from before. Japan, of course, had pledged to double its defense spending prior to the Trump administration, and countries, allies like Australia and the Philippines, South Korea to a degree, were already in the process of transforming their national defense strategies and postures in response to the China challenge. But certainly the Trump administration has made this a priority. They're pushing hard. I think that's a good thing, and I think we all ought to support that. These alliances do need to be rebalanced. I think in terms of critique, I think the biggest challenge the Trump administration is facing in terms of the way that we're managing our alliances is that the trade and economic side of the relationships looks uncoordinated and in some ways discontinuous with what we're trying to do on the defense side. So we're aggravating these relationships. In some instances, we're taking economic actions that are undercutting the economic vitality of our partners at the same time that we're asking them to come closer to us and to spend more on defense. I'm not sure that's a winning formula. There may be opportunities to actually embrace and integrate a little bit more closely with these partners economically in a way that advances our national security as well, and that's something we ought to discuss here today.
Thank you. Mike, thoughts on this?
Sure. Also, thank you to the Federalist Society for putting this together and for having me here today. This is a great panel to be on. The one thing I'd add on this last point that Eli brought up on the economic approach, trade approach, immigration, when we think about the raid on the Hyundai plant a couple months ago, these not only cause tensions government to government, but undermine public support in foreign countries, foreign allies for the alliance. And that's where my main concerns lie when it comes to these sort of the non-security side of the ledger in our approach to managing ties with allies. I fear that we threaten or we risk undercutting public support in those countries for what we're doing. Broadly speaking, I agree with Adam. There's been a lot of continuity. Secretary Hegseth's speech to Shangri-La Dialogue, back in, what was that, May or June, he identified 3 priorities, which were enhancing U.S. forward presence, helping allies develop their own self-defense capabilities, and helping allies and ourselves to reinvigorate our defense industrial bases. These are all positive. These are all, again, continuities with the Biden administration and the previous Trump administration. And so, to the extent that the administration maintains those priorities going forward, that will put us in a good position in Asia.
Richard, on this topic of, is the Trump administration's areas of focus, is it a net positive or is it something else?
I think it's a mixed bag. First of all, thank you to the Federalist Society, and let me echo what Eli said. I think the importance of focusing on China and the China challenge is, if not paramount, very close to the top of what we should be thinking about. So it's great to see the day kicked off this way. I think it's a mixed bag for some of the reasons that our colleagues have said. I mean, there's some things that are good and happening either deliberately or through inertia, the military exercises, the work to try to operationalize the U.S.-Japan alliance, consultations with countries like Australia and things like that. There's some things that are moving backwards. India is not an ally, but the U.S.-India relationship is now at the lowest point in at least 25 years. And it looks like the president may not actually go to the Quad summit in New Delhi, even though the Quad, as Adam was saying, was something that was revived by the president and his team in the first term. The push on defense spending, I think it's pretty hard to not support pushes for our allies to spend more on defense, particularly in a part of the world where China has grown militarily capable so fast. So that is generally positive, but the economic side really does have repercussions. I mean, the tariffs are harming the economies of the very countries we're asking to spend a greater proportion of GDP on defense. It's also at odds to some degree with some of our national security interests in the sense that what we should be doing is identifying areas of economic interaction with China that involve national security risk, either things that are sourced from China that we wish not to be dependent on China for, or things that go to China which we wish to China not to have, and then to trade more with our friends and allies in those areas. But of course, we have tariffs on the entire world simultaneously and are trading less, including with our allies. So that to me seems like a step backward rather than forward.
One of the items that allies of President Trump have often pointed to is this notion of free riding, or the idea that our allies take advantage of the U.S. defense umbrella and that they don't contribute their share, they don't have sufficient skin in the game in the way that the U.S. does. And the second part of that critique is that that behavior by the U.S. in fact encourages this dependency or sort of disincentivizes allies from doing their fair share. And I'm just wondering, is that criticism valid? Are there places where that's been historically valid? Is that still true today? I don't know, Mike, you want to start with maybe that thought?
So I think my take here is, yes, there's been and is free riding, and basically I'm okay with that. In certain cases, Japan in particular, that this is built into the alliance. It was intentionally designed this way. Yes, we want our allies to spend more. I think probably everybody up here agrees on that. burden sharing is a good thing, but at the end of the day, I would argue that the main benefit we get from our alliances is not that the Japanese or the South Koreans are prepared to fight shoulder to shoulder with us, though of course that is a great benefit, but it is access to geography in the region. As you all know, in the wake of World War II, we set about instituting a forward defense perimeter in the West Pacific. This was to ensure we'd never have a repeat of Pearl Harbor. That's been phenomenally successful, and I think will remain a successful approach, even if our allies aren't stepping up in the way we might like them to. So, is there free riding? Yes, that is an issue. It does have the potential to undermine domestic political support here for our alliances, but to me, it is not, or it should not be, a deal killer.
Richard, is that your view as well? That we sort of have this free riding? We all acknowledge free riding happens, and that's just kind of built into the formula, and it's maybe up to U.S. political leaders to explain that to their constituencies as to, why that free riding, the trade that we get is worth it.
Well, first, I think the allies, so we have 5 treaty allies in the Indo-Pacific, and I think all of them are categorically kind of different on this question than the NATO allies, which we expect more of the NATO allies to bargain with NATO. I mean, the first president to rail against NATO not spending enough on defense was Dwight Eisenhower, and every president has done it since, although President Trump has done it more vociferously than most and with more success than most. I think the Asian allies are kind of in a different category, in part because of the reasons that Mike said, right? So Japan, we could have gone home in 1951 when the occupation ended. We decided not to. The fundamental bargain there is defense in exchange for bases and access. For historical reasons, there was a long period of time when the Japanese didn't want to spend a big proportion of their GDP on defense. The region didn't want them to spend a lot on defense, and we weren't too keen on them spending way too much on defense. And so everything kind of fit together. The ROK has been different. Australia has been different. I think Taiwan is more of a question mark there, where they have underinvested in their defense over the years and need to do more. But I think the question now is, because the historical issues and the sort of particularities of our Asian alliances sort of shaped where we got to, is that the right model going forward? I think in Japan, clearly it's not, and the Japanese are the first to have said that, which is why they said they wanted to double their defense budget, making it one of the biggest in the world over a period of 5 years. The Australians are moving up. Again, the Koreans are so focused on peninsular security, that's almost a separate kind of issue. And then I think you have a question, I mean, the gap between where the Taiwanese are on GDP, a percent of GDP, and now the administration calling for 10%, which just seems sort of a number kind of picked out of the air. And I don't know how meaningful that is, but I mean, that's a vast gap, and so that remains a question. So I do think that we shouldn't apply kind of the NATO free rider, these guys just get away with murder and get rich under our protection, sort of dogmatically look at the Asian allies that way, because I do think it's different.
Adam, do we have a free rider problem from your vantage point?
Yeah, I think it's difficult to figure out a metric of, to Mike's point, of what we actually get out of, basing rights and forward staging and that deterrence that provides. So instead, I think we should focus on the fact that although there's been a lot of pain and discord regarding the tariff and trade deals, that in the case of Japan and Korea, I think it offers an opportunity to offset any potential free riding in a creative way, in a more meaningful way. Looking at Korea, the special measures agreement and other arrangements to support our bases there are a relative pittance in the billion, single-digit billions, when you compare it to the $350 billion promised inbound investment that is part of the trade deal. Similar case with Japan, and although I put forth that the Hyundai immigration issue was terrible on the merits and also optically, I think it was overzealous, immigration enforcement or that part of the Trump administration contradicting another piece. I think the inbound investment, which has been strongly commercial, batteries, EVs, et cetera, is not moving on to shipbuilding, is involving semiconductors, which is important for the defense supply chains, and that's much more meaningful than any sort of payback in the form of paying for those costs, and in a way, I think more useful than an up in GDP defense spending, although that should be raised as well.
Yeah, I would just say, I mean, just to amplify what colleagues have said here, the prevailing system and the types of roles that our allies are playing therein was the system of our own creation and our own preference at a time of unrivaled U.S. primacy among the Indo-Pacific rivals, the partners themselves being relatively weaker, and the China challenge from a military perspective being more or less non-existent. Every one of those things has changed, right? U.S. military primacy is no longer sort of the dominant feature in the region. China's military is on track to be a peer competitor to the United States. In some areas is more advanced than the U.S. military, and our allies are now some of the richest, most technologically advanced countries in the world. So the context has changed, and the alliances need to change with it. So I think rather than holding on to a previous construct, we ought to think about what is the appropriate structure for the future. And as it relates to the China challenge, the United States should not be in a position to be unilaterally deterring, or if crisis or conflict come, acting in a contingency unilaterally vis-a-vis China's military. We ought to want our allies and partners in those roles. And I actually think that, maybe disagree with Mike a little bit, I think there is potential for our partners to be playing more of a warfighting role. We're not talking about Taiwan as an ally here, but as a partner, Taiwan's military has an absolutely fundamental role in early stages of a Taiwan contingency. Very important for the U.S. military that the Taiwan military is equipped, trained, and in the fight. And there are real prospects for Japan, Australia, and other partners to play meaningful military roles if they are, again, equipped and if our alliances are sufficiently integrated, which today they're not. And then the other place, in addition to the warfighting, where we need our alliances is on defense industrial base cooperation, because simply our own defense industrial base is not sufficient to keep up with the scale of the China challenge. So we see new and ambitious efforts in Australia. Obviously, the AUKUS initiative gets a lot of attention. Equally important is what they call their GUIO initiative, Guided Weapons Explosive Ordnance Initiative, where they're building out a domestic indigenous munitions base, which will be hugely important to help us grow the collective alliance pie of our capability, which we're going to need to deal with the scale and scope of the China challenge. So I think we ought to be asking more. Historically, Mike's right. Maybe he doesn't disagree with me here in terms of what we'd be shooting for. But I think actually it's within reach to get these partners into the fight. And if we can do that, then I think we can sustain long-term deterrence, and that's why the allies are so important here.
I've heard a couple of the panelists refer to sort of the historic context of sort of how we got to where we are today. So post-World War II, the U.S. has primacy in the Pacific, and we form alliances, and as Richard noted, we have 5 treaty relationships with allies in the region. And the deal essentially was, you let us put our military on your soil, and we'll take care of things, and you sort of let us do what we need to do through airspace, through water, through land. I mean, that's oversimplifying it, but that's sort of what the deal was, I think. And obviously the context has changed, and a couple of you all have made reference to that. Obviously, when, post-World War II, when it was recognized that Russia was the primary threat to Europe, NATO was formed. Should there be something like that put in place? Should there be a more formal defensive alliance being contemplated, or is the current sort of, I'll call it unofficial patchwork arrangement sustainable for the long term? Would it be more provocative? Would the benefits outweigh the costs? I don't know, Eli, maybe if we could start with you and then get the panelists' thoughts on that.
Yeah, and I had a piece in Foreign Affairs a few months ago directly on this topic, making the argument that we do need to evolve toward a collective defense pact in the Indo-Pacific. This is an idea that has been batted around for a long time. We tried one called CETO in the past that fell apart. It was sort of a motley crew of countries. I think times have changed, and we actually, if we start with a core group, which in my view would be the United States, Japan, Australia, and the Philippines, we have sufficient strategic alignment in terms of threat vis-a-vis China to make this politically possible, sort of Trump administration turbulence aside, than it was before. So I think the conditions that didn't make it possible in the past have changed to make it more possible today, but almost more importantly, the demand for something like this is absolutely essential. And in my role at the Pentagon, I spent a lot of time building these various patchworks of trilateral and quadrilateral arrangements. They're all really important, and that was an important evolution, but they're also incomplete. And they really, really do not have the level of command and control integration, the level of actual military planning, the level of force posture integration that we need for actual combat credible deterrence. So if we're serious about integrating our allies in a way that really does make the whole greater than the sum of the parts, then we're going to need to institutionalize it and formalize it. It's not going to be easy. China's going to bark. The allies may not want to make additional commitments, but from a military perspective, it's absolutely what's going to be required for long-term deterrence.
Mike, thoughts on, I don't want to call it CETO 2.0, but is there something more formal that we should have in place?
I'm not sure I really have much to add to what Eli said. I think he's right that the military security case for it is strong. We're all familiar with the politics. This is going to be a challenge. It's long been a challenge, but to some extent, it's starting to happen organically anyway. So Eli mentioned the Philippines. If you look at the number of different models of defense and security agreements the Philippines has signed bilaterally with partners in Asia and in Europe over the past 2 years, it's remarkable. And so there is clearly an interest in sort of deepening security ties within the region, across the region. And right now we have this sort of overlapping web. And to the extent that we can, I'm not sure what the right metaphor is, but move to something that is more integrated, where things aren't overlapping but actually connecting together, I think that that benefits our ability to compete with and yes, contain China.
So half the dais here is in favor of something more. I don't know, Adam, Richard, is it a unanimous view, or is there any dissension? As a moderator, we always want a certain amount of dissension. It makes it a little more interesting. But this
I would say let's not call it CETO 2.0,
that's
or
fine.
an Asian NATO, or something. But that's cosmetic. Look, I think, and everyone should read Eli's piece because it's quite visionary in what it lays out. And I think if you step way back from what it is we're trying to achieve in the Indo-Pacific, at root, we want to avoid war with China without capitulation to Chinese terms and Chinese domination. So what's the best way to do that? Well, I think one of the ways to do that is to credibly deter China from going to war in the first place. How do you credibly deter China from going to war in the best possible way? Well, you build up your own strength, you send the right messages, but you use your unique advantages that we have, which is our alliance system in the region. So the Chinese believe that if they ever made some ill-considered military move, it would be likely to elicit not only a response from the United States, but a response from many countries in the region that have been practicing and working together and so forth. So what does it take? If that's right, then what does it take to get there? So like Eli was saying, the integration on the military commands and things like that, with the exception of U.S. ROK, which is, designed to fight tonight against North Korea if it has to, U.S. Japan, U.S. Australia, these other ones are not close to that, and certainly not with each other. But in the meantime, you've had this informal kind of, you called it patchwork, or people call it cross-bracing, or sort of spreading web of security ties, where you have Australia working more closely with Japan, more with the Philippines, Japan with India, Australia and Japan. And you can sort of see this happening around the region. And so this has all happened informally, but the degree to which you can formalize some of this, I think the greater the deterrence picture will be in the region. The final thing I'll say on this is the big sort of challenge to that vision has always been, well, it's just politically impossible, right? I mean, the Europeans were able to come together at a moment in history, and they built on that over time. You'd never get, for example, the South Koreans and the Japanese to come together. Well, that was true even 5 years ago, for sure. Under President Yoon, he came in, and very good ties between Seoul and Tokyo. And President Lee, when he was in the opposition, criticized that. Now that President Lee's there, he went to Tokyo. First time a Korean president has gone to Japan for his first overseas visit in 40 years or something like this. And so, you know, the new realities of security in the region have the chance to change what was politically impossible before into something that may be politically possible in the future.
Yeah.
Adam, thoughts on this?
Briefly, I would agree with Eli's thesis, generally speaking, and I think it would be, the building block of it would be the engine of the U.S.-Japan relationship, and then the most practical of the mini-laterals, the U.S.-Japan, Philippines, as Mike pointed out, the relationship there, and the fact that there's a practical application in preparing for the Taiwan contingency, in patrolling the South China Sea, which is already happening. And that's 3 of the 4 allies.
Yeah, I would just say, maybe just to build on a couple comments here, I think what Richard was describing and Mike as and now Adam as the growing cooperation between the partners themselves is just so fundamentally important, and again, different than what we've seen in the past. Folks who study the Indo-Pacific know this well, but the construct that we had for years was what we called a hub and spoke model, where the United States was the hub and it had spokes to its own bilateral alliances without relationships between them. That has started to change. We have Australia and Japan leaders in those countries talking about their relationship as alliance-like. They don't have a formal commitment with each other, but they're starting to act like they do. As Mike was mentioning, the Philippines has signed reciprocal access agreements with both Japan and now Australia that permits Japanese and Australian forces to operate in and around the Philippines. The United States obviously has access agreements in the Philippines. So we start having these opportunities where we can bring the partners together in really new and interesting ways. I think just connecting to our earlier part of the conversation, though, I think we have to be thinking about ensuring that the United States doesn't have to be at the center of all that, and certainly we ought to encourage them to be cooperating with each other. That's a good thing even when we're not there, but that is under the assumption that our relationships with these partners are still strong. And I think what we are going to see potentially is that if, and again, maybe not the closest of close alliance partners, but countries like Singapore, partners like India, they will, in the absence of a close security relationship with the United States or a perceived one, they're going to start diversifying their relationships and taking steps with the Europeans, other Indo-Pacific powers. It doesn't mean that they're going to flip and somehow start bandwagoning with China, but they are going to diversify their relationships in a way where the relative focus on the United States is going to be smaller. And I don't think that's a good thing for the United States. So we ought to encourage this integration between our partners, but we want to be part of that story as well.
And just picking up on that theme of, you know, the strength of our alliance, there are core members that we've all been talking about, certain countries that we believe are very firmly in our camp. There are other countries that you might say are more peripheral, isn't the right word, but that, you know, they're watching the weather. And so I'm wondering, how does the panel think about China's influence operation, China's alliance building? Obviously, China's been very busy, building out military bases in East Africa, Belt and Road Initiative to attract commerce for the benefit of domestic Chinese manufacturers and service providers. So I was wondering if the panel could kind of talk a little bit about China's alliance building and its networking versus U.S. efforts, and maybe in regions that we haven't talked as much about, such as in South America and Africa. And how do you assess the China alliance compared to the U.S. alliance? And I don't know, but Richard, maybe we could start with you on that one.
Well, China doesn't really have allies. I mean, North Korea, maybe Cambodia, I guess. And that's basically it. You can contrast that with the allies we have in the Indo-Pacific, our close security partners like Singapore and, at least until very recently, India and others, obviously NATO, other allies and partners around the world, which is a real comparative strength for the United States. China is projecting influence in a variety of ways. Its economic gravity and its economic interactions with countries has been sort of the leading edge of that, and it's tried to convert that economic interaction into diplomatic political influence, and to some degree more security partnerships. China, we know, has a global basing strategy. It would love to have bases all over the world, just like the United States has bases all over the world. If it had bases in particular areas, then that would certainly constrain the freedom of action, for example, of the US Navy and things in ways that wouldn't be good. But I think part of the story of the last few years, I think, is how little China has been able to successfully convert the advantages it had into successful outcomes on the security partnership front. Yes, there are countries that'll take free stuff from China and that will have China as their number one trade partner, but they seem not to really want to get into formal security agreements with China, nor to trust Beijing all that much. Now that said, we could shoot ourselves in the foot to some degree and help the Chinese. So for example, if you look at the August and September trade numbers, countries that are under tariffs from the United States are trading more with China to make up for the lost trade with the United States. The greater the Chinese economic influence in countries, the greater ability they will have, at least in principle, to convert some of this into other outcomes. But so far, if you sort of look at a balance sheet, what's China achieving on the sort of ally side? I don't think there's much to show for it.
And Adam, do you take a similar view that Chinese efforts to build out influence around the world, maybe particularly from a security perspective, have been largely underwhelming?
I really do, and I think Richard encapsulated it well, but I guess it's worth just mentioning, and most folks in this room understand, the most consequential security-related relationships are, at this time that China is engaged in, are purely transactional and are mostly tied to the Ukraine war and the needs of the Russian military machine in the form of dual use and potentially military material itself. And I think once the Ukraine war has abated, that no limits partnership is going to fade out. With North Korea being the only formal relationship, and that always being a wild card, and especially since that regime has gotten nuclear weapons, maybe a wash for the Chinese regime. And right now, North Korea's relationship with Russia completely eclipsing China's relationship with North Korea, and the South Koreans are much more interested, much more concerned about that situation. And I'd echo Richard in the sense that, these Belt and Road initiatives are completely exploitative of natural resources or labor, or, flooding markets with excess goods, and they do not include a reciprocal or meaningful defense relationship for China.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that critique, but I'm quite sure that if you ask leaders in Beijing, how does the geopolitical chessboard look to you right now? How are you feeling about your overall progression in terms of expanding international influence? I think their answer would be, we're succeeding beyond our wildest dreams. I think they see themselves as having momentum. I think their expectation of U.S. decline is happening by their measures, maybe faster than they anticipated, as they see themselves rightfully rising back to a position of global dominance. And I think they would point to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the BRICS mechanism, what they're achieving at the UN in terms of altering international processes and norms, that sort of right before our eyes, they're transforming the international system to something much more to their liking. So I think they would see themselves as on the march. We may disagree with that, but I think that would be their own, particularly in the developing world, but globally as well. In terms of security cooperation in particular, yes, they don't have formal alliances like we do, potentially with the exception of North Korea's Richard mentioned, but they've been very focused on supporting regimes around the world in terms of their internal security, which actually to most governments around the world is much more their priority and obsession, rather than worrying about some sort of external intervention. So they do have, in my view, alliances. They're a different kind of relationship. They're focused on internal security. In terms of our own assessment and our own response, I guess just a couple principles I would have in mind. One would be, we really need to prioritize in terms of where we think the most important strategic areas of the world are, because China is in fact in Africa and Latin America and the Middle East, And we will drive ourselves crazy and dilute our resources trying to chase every form of Chinese influence around the world. So at least, again, looking back on my experience at the Pentagon, I always was concerned when I heard whether it was in an alternative place outside the Indo-Pacific, military leaders saying, hey, I'm really worried about China's military relationship with country X. We, the United States, needs to be the partner of choice. So we need to start putting resources in terms of our relationship with that country. That's true if that's a strategically important piece of geography or there's something particularly strategically relevant around that country, but it is not the case that every place in the world on every metric we need to be one notch up higher than China. We need to be comfortable with them expanding power and influence in ways that are less relevant to us, and we need to focus and really narrow our resources on the places that matter. So that would be one, and I think the other would be we need to be realistic about the fact that yes, countries are looking at the weather, and not all of them, and many of them are not going to somehow flip to being a Japan-like or Australia-like alliance partner, and we just need to be comfortable with these countries having relationships with the United States, having relationships with China, and us maximizing our interests therein. So with countries like India or other parts of the developing world, we need to find a way to maneuver in with their existing relationships with China.
Sorry, Eli, you reminded me, the Pacific Islands, that's a place where China's training domestic security forces and infiltrating politically, and it's a relatively easy lift if we start investing there and start, doing this.
Yeah, and a great example of a place that's really important strategically, and we should be doing a better job at little cost.
Right. So to Eli's point, what are those critical parts of the world? Like, is West Africa as important as the Pacific Islands from a China deterrence perspective or a U.S. Military freedom of action? No. And so if you get into the situation where you say, well, China is making these investments all over Africa and all over the Western Hemisphere and all over the Indo-Pacific, and by the way, in Central Asia and all this stuff, so we sort of have to contest that everywhere equally, we'll never succeed. The most important places right now are the Pacific Islands and Southeast Asia for reasons we can get into, which is why, for example, on the Pacific Islands, I'm sort of perplexed by our current approach because the first Trump administration and then the Biden administration made all these efforts to try to contest increasing Chinese influence at the Pacific Islands, opening embassies, sending Peace Corps in there, increasing foreign aid, doing diplomatic visits, bringing the Pacific Island leaders here, all these other things. But then this year we have told them all that we're tariffing their countries and cutting their foreign aid off or in half, which seems to me going the opposite direction that we would want to go if we're trying to contest Chinese influence in a particularly strategically critical part of the world.
And also just to add, getting back to the alliance theme, there are places in the world where our allies can carry the burden of repelling and dealing with Chinese influence. And so Pacific Islands, for instance, Australia and New Zealand, some of the European partners, French who are resident power there, have a fundamental role, and we can work with them and be an equal partner with them and not have to be the one that's carrying the burden on this, and that's true elsewhere in the world as well.
Mike, I just want to get you in on this discussion around, your assessment of China's alliance building efforts and.
Yeah, no, I would add two things to what's been said. So, just on this kind of last point that Richard and Eli were making, if we are serious about competing in Southeast Asia, for example, and deploying more resources there, China will respond to that and have less resources to throw all over Africa and South America, right? It's an iterative competition. The last thing I note on sort of going back to the earlier part of the discussion is I do think there's reason to be quite worried about sort of an emerging axis among China, Russia, North Korea, Iran. Iran's looking weak right now. We'll see if that remains the case. It's not an alliance like the NATO alliance or like our bilateral alliances in the Indo-Pacific. They are not sitting around a table coordinating everything they do, but I do think all four countries have a shared interest in revising the post-war order that has benefited us so well. They may have different visions for what the order should look like, but they're all committed to significantly reforming it, if not tearing it down entirely. And so I think in the sort of short term, there's the potential for these countries to do a lot of damage. I suspect that this alignment is not as, or will not prove to be as enduring as America's alliance have proven alliances have proven to be. But in the coming years, I think this is a serious concern for us.
Get your questions ready. I've got one more question for the panel, and then I'll open it up to the audience. Final question, and it's not completely hypothetical given who we have on this panel. You may well be doing this work, but President Trump's term will end in January of 2029. And there will be a new president at the end of January 2029. Whether it's a Republican or a Democrat, we don't obviously know. But are there alliance building projects that you anticipate that will require continuity? Where do you see opportunities for continuity from this administration to the next? I don't know who would like to start with that.
I think you need continuity in all of these projects. And again, if you step back from some of the specific changes that we've seen, especially this year, that affect these things like tariffs and some of this other stuff, there's been remarkable continuity from the first Trump administration through the Biden administration through now. I mean, the Biden administration's approach to the Indo-Pacific and to China, I think, bore much more resemblance to the first Trump administrations than it did to the Obama administrations, both in the way they diagnosed the challenge in the region and what they thought was the remedy and what needed to happen. That's allowed a number of years toward these projects, but, you know, for example, operationalizing the U.S.-Japan alliance in a much closer, more integrated way, and that's a multi-year kind of endeavor. I mean, Australia, we've moved from a relationship with Australia where we never even thought about the Indo-Pacific. They would go fight in the mountains of Afghanistan and talk to us about the Middle East and things like that, into something focused more on the region. That's still very much a work in progress. If you look at AUKUS, you're talking about multiple years out there. So all of these things will require continuity beyond the current administration and the next one, which is why it's so important to get kind of the big things right here. What really are we trying to achieve in the Indo-Pacific? What are we really worried about from a national security standpoint? What really are advantages, and then how do we maximize those?
Adam, thoughts on continuity?
Well, yeah, I'll take implied in the question that there's sort of a strand within the MAGA movement or the Trump administration that might be a break from the previous administrations that you're mentioning. And I think, generally speaking, I don't think that's likely. If we take on a foreign policy level, the most likely successors to be J.D. Vance or Marco Rubio, and things could change in 3 or 4 years. I think that wing, and you can call it the Tucker Carlson wing or whatever you wish, was really chastened by the Iran situation over the summer, where there was a very sharp and brief military interdiction that was redounded to our benefit. Actually, I would argue enabled us to pivot to the Pacific more effectively by sort of defanging the central node of the issue in the Middle East. Now, a lot of people on a certain segment of the MAGA movement were saying that this would result in a world war or something along those lines. So I think that I would predict that the next Republican administration would continue along similar lines, and I think that's a positive thing, and I think it does mean something that Marco Rubio holds, is top in both the State Department and the NSC, even though if it might be diminished, that says something about President Trump's confidence in future relationships.
Eli, thoughts on continuity issues?
I mean, maybe I'll offer a yes and maybe and a no. I think on the yes, in terms of continuity, this question of reciprocity in our alliance, our allies doing more, asking more of them in terms of defense spending, that's something we should continue. As we've been talking about here, though, today, that needs to be broadened beyond just defense spending toward roles and missions and defense industrial base, and asking them to play, to the extent that they can, much more of an equal partner role in some of these relationships. So I think that the move toward reciprocity and rebalancing of the alliances will continue. That's yes. I think in the maybe category, particularly with what we saw with the action China took last week in terms of just this outrageous new export control on rare earths that's going to affect essentially everything in the U.S. economy, there's a real urgency for the United States to work with its allies and partners to try to build secure supply chains. Now, whether or not the Trump administration does that, I think, is a question mark. There's certainly folks inside the administration who do want to do that. There's good energy on the Hill for that if we can take advantage of it. That's not something we are going to be able to do unilaterally at the pace that we need to do it at. So as we're thinking about mining in Australia and processing in Japan and how we're integrating with our allies and partners, there is room there for a major project to try to secure our supply chains over time. And I think if the administration has the wherewithal to do that, the next team will pick that up, absolutely. I think in the no, in terms of the discontinuity, this is my hope. The United States has never actually prioritized China as its dominant national security challenge. So we've written strategies that said that. Richard has wrote a whole book explaining how this is the case. But we have said time and again, national defense strategy after national defense strategy, China is the premier challenge. We have these national security strategies. Our foreign policy has never actually reflected that in terms of the urgency and attention and resources that we're putting after the China challenge. That's certainly true today in the Trump administration. They are not prioritizing China as the premier national security challenge for the United States, and that needs to change. So I hope if they don't get their act together in the next couple of years, that once and for all, when the next administration says it, they actually mean it, and they close the say-do gap on that issue.
Mike, thoughts on?
I guess the only thing I'd add, I mean, so I agree that broadly speaking, there's likely to be continuity on our approaches to sort of building our alliances, building our relationships in the Indo-Pacific. You know, a concern for me is the breakdown of what was something like a bipartisan consensus on international trade and economic relations. And I think now that allies have to worry about the potential for real significant swings every 4 years and how we're going to be engaging with them when it comes to economic ties, it just makes it harder for them to plan, makes it harder for businesses to plan. And again, as I sort of mentioned at the start here, threatens to undermine domestic political support in those countries for our alliances. And so if we can't get ourselves to a position of a bit more stability, whichever way that goes, even if it's stability on the, consensus on the question of high tariffs, providing some stability in what our approach will be, I think that will help support the efforts where we need to continue investing on the security front. If we can't get to that, it'll be just a little bit more complicated.
Great. If you've got a question, we have a microphone in the back, and we've got one probably about 3 rows back. If you get in line, and I don't care which microphone you show up at, I will try and call in turn. So yes. And if you wouldn't mind, I'm sorry, if you wouldn't mind telling us if you have an association with an institution or organization or media, and give us your name, that'd be appreciated.
My name is Bonnie Wachtel. I'm in the investment business. And if you don't mind, I'm going to ask 2 questions because one of them really just jumped out at me in the last minute, and that's your comments, Mr. Ratner, about, you said the U.S. is not recognizing China as their principal defense concern, and you also said you don't think we're operationalizing sufficient focus on materials in the rare earths. I'm just blown away. I mean, from what I've seen recently about the rare earths, that should be the next Manhattan Project. And God knows how we got into a situation where the military is dependent on China for essential. Somebody should be answering that. But it seems to me that maybe this is something that's presented to the public. It's not really what's going on in Pentagon thinking, and I hope that's true. Just very quickly, my second question would be about the sanctions regime. It seems to me the sanctions on India, on oil, that's how we lost India, or at least had a rift there. Europe doesn't seem to be doing very well with its energy supplies. That also comes from the sanctions on Russian oil. I'm struck by one conceptual idea of this framework, which is that the war is already, World War III is already underway. It's the war for the dollar. I wonder how you feel about these economic sanctions now. Aren't we just raising the price of oil and not doing much good other than maybe symbolically? Thanks very much.
Thank you. Eli, do you want to start with you in response to some of her
Sure. I
comments?
mean, to the first intervention, yes. I mean, our country has whether it's the Manhattan Project or Operation Warp Speed, we have an opportunity here to invest a significant amount of resources in a bipartisan project to secure our supply chains around the world. We ought to do that. I hope the administration moves forward with that. And I think we ought to integrate our allies and partners in part of that, which will be easier if we have better trade and economic relationships with them. So I think that is right on the doorstep for U.S. national security as an important initiative. And on the India front, again, Richard has also written a good book on the Indo-Pacific. He's written a good article recently on the India question, so he can get that into more detail. But it is a good example of the inconsistency of the Trump administration, where there are other reasons why the India relationship is in a bit of a trough. It's not just the trade sanctions, but that's part of it. There are other missteps. But on the sanctions piece, yes, we have moved out on sanctioning India over its oil purchases of Russian oil. We have U.S. cabinet officials out on TV saying we're going to be pressuring Europeans to also sanction India at a time when we are not holding China accountable for its purchases of oil from Russia. So it's just, it does not make any sense from a strategic or policy-making perspective, and I really hope the administration finds a way back to a functioning relationship with India, because it is so counterproductive in the China context.
Comment, Richard, on?
Yeah, I mean, the deterioration in the U.S.-India relationship came after the resolution of the short war between India and Pakistan earlier this year, when the Pakistanis nominated President Trump for a Nobel Peace Prize and gave him full credit for stopping the war. And he said that, in fact, he stopped the war, and Prime Minister Modi did not give him said credit. And this has been sort of a sore point in terms of external mediation in Indo-Pac affairs for the Indians for decades and decades. And that's really where things started to fall apart. So now we're in this situation where India has a 25% tariff in addition to the existing 25% tariff on it, so 50% total, 25% tariff on it for importing Russian oil. So that's a much higher tariff than China has for importing more oil from Russia than India does, but it's also a higher tariff than Russia has on it for producing Russian oil. So if this is supposed to be a close strategic relationship, you try to make sense of this, and I think it's pretty hard to make sense of this. Should the Indians stop buying Russian oil? Yes. They imported their total imports of Russian oil before the war was 0.4% of their total. Now it's like 40%. They've taken advantage of discounted prices. In the Biden administration, they were encouraged to do that as long as the price was below the price cap that had been negotiated. So we've gone as a country from encouraging them to buy Russian oil to saying we're going to penalize you for Russian oil. So there's a way to do these things, but the way this has been done is not it.
Yeah. There's a gentleman at the back mic, and then I'll come back to the front mic. So.
Thank you. Hi, my name's Randall. I'm not with the media, I'm not with a fellowship or anything. I'm just a lawyer who loves the Federalist Society and went to graduate school for foreign affairs. My question is about Latin America and China's involvement in Latin America. They're building schools, which are really just propaganda outlets. They're trying to sort of take over the Panama Canal maybe, or maybe just build a whole new Panama Canal in Nicaragua. My question for the panel is it time for a westward-facing Monroe Doctrine where we establish that the United States and not China should be the leader in the Western Hemisphere?
Mike, do you want to start with that, and we can go to others?
Yes. I think harder to pull off than just declaring a new doctrine. But this goes to the discussion we had earlier about prioritizing countries and regions. And certainly I think, our own backyard is a region of the world where we should be prioritizing our relationships and our influence. And we have not done that for a long time.
And Eli, I'd like to get your thoughts on this question too, because you were talking about prioritizing based on geography and strategic interests. Is Latin America a concern for you in terms of Chinese activity?
Well, I think, again, you got to be particular, and as Mike said, prioritize. So from a defense perspective, we can talk about the broader influence question. From a defense perspective, we ought to be concerned about the question of PLA basing, and we are, and so being actively engaged on that issue, using all the tools of national power to understand where those conversations are and ensure we're getting in front of them. That's number one. China's also pursuing space-based capabilities in Latin America that we need to be aware of. It's often under the cover of educational, scientific experimentation or cooperation. So I think being coordinating with countries in the region, with their intelligence and law enforcement agencies, and unearthing some of these malign PRC activities are really important. But I guess my response to the question would be, yes, we need to be concerned about this, but we also need to be maybe more confident as a nation that we're willing to be in a competitive environment with China, and that if we bring our national strengths to bear, that it's okay if these countries have a relationship with China, as long as it doesn't start impinging on our core national interests.
Well, if you believe the reporting on the NDS, then the Western Hemisphere will be the main focus, hopefully not to the detriment of focusing on Asia. And also, it's a great opportunity to spin up the Manhattan Project of the rare earth elements, because there are problems with permitting and real problems with pollution. As a conservative, I'll say real challenges to overcome in mining in the United States. So we have to take advantage of mines that already exist and processing that already exists.
Molly?
Hi, my name is Molly Nixon. I'm an attorney at Pacific Legal Foundation, where I focus on separation of powers, which informs my next question for the panel, which is, does anyone have any thoughts about Congress's role? Does Congress have any role here or any involvement either in maybe constraints on the executive changing policies in light of the continuity and stability concerns, or forcing mechanisms to pursue some of the policies that you've identified, strengthening the relationship with India, or engaging more with the Pacific Islands? Thanks.
Anyone want to take role of Congress?
Hugely important. I think particularly at this time, fundamentally critical in several ways. One would be, I think, to what I think Mike said earlier about the importance of trying to maintain some kind of bipartisan approach to the China challenge. There is positive energy on Capitol Hill. I had the opportunity last week to engage with Senator Ricketts and Senator Coons, who are the ranking and chairman of the East Asia Committee on the Foreign Relations Committee. They're traveling together. They're doing legislation together. That's exactly what we need to rise to this challenge. Congress also obviously provides resources, and in the alliance and partner category, Congress is the one who's appropriating toward foreign military financing and other types of security cooperation. So whether it's the Pacific Islands or Taiwan or the Philippines, it will ultimately be up to Congress as to whether they're going to sufficiently support the modernization of our partners. And then the other category I would add would be on technology controls, where the administration, as all administrations do, they get pulled in a lot of different directions between economic interests, private interests, and national security interest. And Congress has a role to, I think, put down some stricter controls in an environment where the administration is maybe waffling more than it should be on these questions.
Any other thoughts on Congress? Okay. I think there's someone at the back microphone.
Good morning. Abby Salter, no relevant affiliations. This was touched on a little bit, but China seems to be, so to say, putting a stake in a lot of countries that aren't part of the mentioned core alliances. You know, putting the schools and 5G in South America, taking up African countries and having partnerships for oil, lithium, rare earth elements, then conducting or entering into agricultural partnerships that are operating to a detriment to the US, like soybeans in Brazil, and now the US has all these soybeans and they have nowhere to go. So I'm curious how these actions are playing into the global power political landscape, and if it's affecting at all the alliances that have been discussed, whether it's weakening the US alliance, strengthening the China alliance, and if it's doing either of those, how do we compete or at the very least keep up?
Yeah, and I think that's similar to a question we had a little while ago about the role of the U.S. in South America. And if I'm being fair, I've heard Eli say, in certain places, we've got to be comfortable just competing with China head on, if it's a commercial engagement or it's a cultural engagement. I've heard, but I don't want to, does any panelist want to take this one? Is there anything? Yeah, I think the consensus of the panel is, or at least the view of the panel is, that there are certain places where we need to accept that China is going to be engaging with certain countries around the world, and the U.S. doesn't necessarily need to be number one in every country in every dimension. I think we've got time for one last question. The gentleman at the front.
Hello, I'm Bobby Shore. I work in international trade. Thank you to the panelists for the thought-provoking discussion on building our alliance network in the region. Could you please talk about the receptiveness and political constraints for Japan and South Korea to further deepen security cooperation, given that China is their largest trading partner and that they may have more to lose given that they would be on the front line in a regional conflict? Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone want to take that?
I'll start. The first thing I'll say is that they are doing that already, right? Cautiously, but increasingly less cautiously, right? So, the first hurdle is getting the two countries to work together. We'll see how things look under the new South Korean president, but I'd say so far, so good. It's also important to consider that the two countries have still different conceptions of the Chinese security threat. For Japan, it's much more pressing, it's more urgent. Japan has deep concerns about the Chinese approach to Taiwan, for example. Korea's conception is not quite as, not quite as urgent, not quite as pressing as Japan's. Its overriding concern remains North Korea, a war on the peninsula. I don't think we want South Korea to change that. That makes sense, and we want South Korea to be focused on that to a great extent. You are right that Korea is concerned about the economic relationship with China coming under threat by, viewing more closely to Japanese and American views of the China challenge. But again, I think things are moving in the right direction. I think we need to be more concerned with the fact of that movement than the speed of it.
Any other thoughts on that question? I see sealed lips. I see an audience ready for a break, so please join me in thanking this panel. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it was great.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, that's great.